Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to yet another Horus Heresy lore summary video. We are still on book 2, and this will be the second part of that particular book's lore breakdown. I originally thought I could make all of this into one video, but, well, I just can't help myself from rambling on about the various topics of interest, so we're just gonna have to split it up a little bit, I'm afraid. Last time, Loken had just arrived on Davin proper, just in time to watch the massive stone doors of the Serpent Lodge temple slam shut behind the recumbent form of Horus Lupercal. Loken was unsurprisingly rather angry, shall we say, at his brothers for having done this. As far as he was concerned, they had just sent their Primarch into the hands of a bunch of moon-worshipping savages on the off chance that they might be able to do what the Emperor's finest apothecaries could not, which seemed like a bit of a fucking long shot. But at this point in time, there wasn't a whole lot that Loken could do. The majority of the Lodge had agreed to this, and that included a lot of the Legion's senior command personnel, including Ezekiel Abaddon. The only thing that Loken could possibly have done at this point was to raise his bolt pistol up on high and put an explosive round right between Abaddon's eyes. Might have been a pretty damn good idea considering what would happen later, but hey, at this point in time, Loken was not ready to take quite such a drastic step. Thusly, all that anyone could really do was to simply just wait. According to the old legends, if a man was found worthy by the gods who resided within the temple, then he would push open the doors and walk out on his own. But if he was not found worthy, then after 10 days the door would open on their own, and the corpse could be collected. And so, with not a whole lot to do, Loken simply returned to orbit, resigned, more or less, to the fact that Horus was probably a goner. He handed over the anatheme to the apothecaries, who couldn't make neither heads nor tails of what the fuck the damn thing was. And to make matters even worse, Erebus was nowhere to be found, so Loken couldn't even just go over to him and vent some of his anger. At this point in time, Loken was pretty damn sure that Erebus had something to do with this. He still might not directly suspect Erebus of handing the weapon to Temba, but he knew that Erebus had some sort of connection to the weapon, and since the weapon was last seen in Eugene Temba's hands, well, 1 + 1 usually equals traitor. Unbeknownst to Loken, however, and probably the majority of the Legion, was that this was no mere temple. If Loken had known what Erebus and the Lodge in all due likelihood knew, then he probably would not have been quite so resigned, shall we say? Because this was not some mere temple dedicated to some make-believe and forgotten god, no. This was a proper temple dedicated to the ruinous powers. Erebus, and probably the Lodge, would have known this. Now, it is unclear at this point in time exactly how much the Lodges themselves knew. We know that Erebus definitely knew precisely what the ruinous powers were. I'm pretty sure that he didn't even really just accept their bullshit, which we will have delivered to us in not too long in the books. He probably knew that they were rather, malicious entities. The Lodges themselves is a different question entirely. I don't think they knew anywhere near as much as the Word-Bearers. I think they simply just knew that these entities were real, and they had power. I suspect that's pretty much all they really knew. I'm thinking that perhaps they ate a lot more of the bullshit that was delivered by Erebus. And speaking of said bullshit, so, now that Horus was inside the temple, he was, through the means of a ritual, sent into the warp, or at the very least his spirit was sent into the warp while his body was still alive. This meant that, for all intents and purposes, Horus was stuck in the Immaterium, in a non-physical form, similar somewhat to what Psychus could do, except in a far more hands-on matter. Essentially, Horus had, to begin with, no real inkling as to whether or not what he was seeing was real or fake. Indeed, when he woke up, the first words he utters was, "So this is heaven," indicating quite clearly that he figured he was dead and, in the afterlife. However, that was of course not quite the case. And quite quickly, Horus was joined by a familiar face. Hastur Sejanus, one of Horus's all-time favorites within the Legion, and the Astartes that we heard about being killed in the first book in the Horus Heresy series. He was the Astartes that was sent to treat with the false emperor. Now again, Hastur Sejanus, if you didn't remember him, was by far Horus's absolute favorite, and indeed many in the Legion would consider him to be the absolute best of them all. Probably one of the reasons why he was knocked off so early. As we will learn later on, this whole conspiracy to turn Horus had probably been going on for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. As such, I do not think that it was any coincidence that Hastur Sejanus was killed at that precise moment in time. At this point, however, Hastur Sejanus was apparently with Horus in the Immaterium. But we know better. The warp is a place of deceit, of lies, and half-truths. And this was no exception. Hastur Sejanus was in fact Erebus, wearing his face as a part of a ruse to present Horus with the viewpoints of the Chaos Gods from a familiar face. Not Hastur Sejanus told Horus that he had been selected as an ambassador for the various creatures that lived within the warp. They hoped that Horus would take their message to the material world and explain to the material world that they just wanted to live in peace and harmony. The creatures within the warp were intelligent, but they did not want to affect the material world in any way. They really didn't give a shit about the material world. All they wanted to do was to be left alone, and apparently what the Emperor was currently doing was slowly but surely eroding their domain, threatening to wipe them out entirely. Now, a lot of questions has been asked whether or not the Emperor should have told his Astartes and the Primarchs about chaos, because it would have left them with more tools to combat chaos when it tried to, well, screw with their minds. On the other hand, it is made rather clear here that what he was doing was working. By trying to simply rid the galaxy of all religions and all false beliefs and replacing them with the cold hard light of science, he was destroying the Chaos Gods by their very source, their root, if you will. He was taking away their source of power. Again, the Chaos Gods draw power from emotions and the strength of these emotions, worship being a rather powerful one, and sacrifice in their name being one of the most powerful ones. Now, eradicating them entirely would essentially be impossible, since Khorne will always be able to draw energy from the simple act of bloodletting. However, to maintain an entity like Khorne, a fully sentient god, essentially, requires a hell of a lot more than incidental emotions. In all due likelihood, he would be more or less entirely reliant upon acts of worship in one form or the other, be it directed directly to him as Khorne or one of his tens of thousands of simulacrum deities. These are deities that are not known as Khorne, but are essentially just him in the guise of another god. For example, the savages of one planet might refer to him as the Hound, or the Bloodthirsty One, or, Satan, stuff like that. The name, at the end of the day, is unimportant, as long as the intention behind the sacrifice is the same. And this is one of those lovely half-truths. You see, the Chaos Gods understand that to trick a being as intelligent as a Primarch, they can't just lie to him, because Horus would almost certainly pick up on that. Instead, they tell him the truth. The Emperor's plans are endangering their existence. It is, well, threatening to annihilate them, essentially. But what they don't tell Horus, of course, is that they are not quite as benign as Horus at first might have thought. Yes, they have no real interest in taking over the material world. They just have an interest of plunging it into uncontrollable bloodshedding and chaos for all eternity. And now we get to one of my favorite moments in the entire goddamn book series. To try and convince Horus, he is shown a vision of the future. The god shows him a vision of a huge metropolis, a heaving, throbbing hive city, filled to the brink with millions of humans. Immediately, Horus notices the rather macabre architectural design choices. There are skulls everywhere, imperial aquillas, brooding angels staring down upon the heaving throngs of humanity. It all just seems so bleak and oppressive compared to the Imperium that Horus knows. He finds it particularly disturbing that all of these millions, if not billions of people all thronged together in these streets are heading to one single destination, a massive cathedral. It becomes rather obvious, rather quickly, that they are worshippers, and that this entire planet is a gargantuan temple to some unknown deity. In a massive square in front of the cathedral, he sees 10 huge statues, all raised up on massively tall plinths, with a particularly large statue in the center. This central figure is clearly the deity that all of these billions are praying to. The statues that surround it are 9 statues of massive warriors, and at first, Horus does not recognize them. But upon closer inspection, he finally recognizes them as crude interpretations of his brother Primarchs. He sees Jagatai Khan, Leman Russ, Rogel Dawn, Sanguinius, Ferrus Manus, Robute Gilliman, Vulcan, and Corvus Corax all surrounding this one central figure, who, at first, Horus cannot identify. It actually takes him quite a while before he realizes that the statue is supposed to represent the Emperor, although the artist has singularly failed to capture the sheer charisma and the dynamic nature of the man that Horus Lupercal calls father. But far more important than the lack of artistic merit evident in this statue was the question, what the fuck is going on here? The Emperor himself, the foremost champion of a secular galactic empire, raised up on a plinth and worshipped by millions, surrounded by 9 of his Primarchs. That just doesn't make a whole lot of sense, no matter how you look at it. But perhaps what Horus found even more disturbing was that there was no statues of him. Hell, there was no statues of another 8 of his brothers. Where was Lorgar, the most devout of all of the Emperor's children? If the Emperor was to be worshipped as a deity, surely Lorgar should be here. Surely this would have to be Lorgar's work, in fact, but no sign of him. No sign of Angron, Mortarion, Petarabo, Magnus, and perhaps most strikingly of all, no statue of the War Master, the Emperor's chosen. Here in this square, his father was raised up as some kind of god, but his favored son was nowhere to be seen. The very son that won him the galaxy. That very son appeared to have been forgotten. And that was not a fact that fell on particularly understanding shoulders. As previously mentioned, we have seen several cases of Horus having a little bit of an ego. And finally, it would appear that Horus himself realized this, as he finally came to understand that he wanted this. He wanted the adulation of the crowd, to be worshipped, to be praised and held up on high. He wanted to, at the very least, be recognized, and yet here, he had been completely and utterly erased from history. That was not easy for Horus to bear, not to mention the simple fact that this all looked dangerously much so like open betrayal of everything they had fought for. Not only had the Emperor apparently turned himself into a deity that needed to be worshipped, in stark contrast to his supposed ideals of creating a secular galaxy, but he had forgotten fully half of his sons after he had raised himself up. But why would he do such a thing? Why would he change all of this and go back on everything he had ever said, unless perhaps he had grown jealous of Horus, of the War Master's accomplishment? Perhaps he had led Horus to believe he was his favored son, then given him the mantle of War Master and expected him to fail, as he had done with the Interrex. Perhaps this was all a step in a plan to discredit the War Master and fully half of his Primarchs. After all, was it not the Emperor who had saddled Horus with the Remembrance's orders, and all of these bureaucrats constantly clamoring for his time and attention? Did the Emperor want him to fail? No, it can't be, but what other answer is there? What other possible explanations could there be for this future? These were the questions that ran through Horus Lupercal's mind as he ran from the Great Square and got himself lost in this dystopian future city, seeing yet more evidence that this was not the Imperium he had fought and bled for. This was not a shining beacon of humanity, of progress and advancement. This was a mausoleum city that worshipped death. This was not a good future. This was not the future he wanted to create. And so, finally, when Hasta Sejanus, or Erebus, finally found Horus again several hours later, it was time for them to leave this future and get an answer out of Horus. I love this part. I really, really love this part, because this is the future. The Chaos Gods did in no way whatsoever lie to Horus. They only withheld one tiny kernel of information, namely that this was the future that he, Horus, would create, not the Emperor. And that's what I love about it so much. It's so ingenious, it's so subtle, and best of all, it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. The moment Horus sees this, he might join them. And if he does, he will be doing everything in his power to make this very future come true. Therefore, everywhere he turns, he will just be seeing further evidence that he was right all along. And the final coup de grace is delivered not by Erebus, not by the Chaos Gods or any of their servants, but by Magnus, his well-meaning brother, who had thrown his own astral body through the Immaterium all the way from Prospero by the means of a huge ritual, all with the express intention of saving Horus from himself. In the process, he rips the falsehood off Erebus, revealing him to be not Hasta Sejanus, but Erebus. Horus is not particularly happy to have this revealed to him, not in the slightest. However, Magnus makes one fatal mistake. He plays straight into the hands of the ruinous powers by telling Horus to remember who he is, which is exactly what the Chaos God wants him to hear. Because his whole life, Horus has measured himself up against the Emperor. He fought side by side with the Emperor for longer than any Primarch and idealized him like no other Primarch, except perhaps Lorgar. And every time he measured himself against the Emperor, he found himself wanting. As a strategist, as a diplomat, as an administrator, as a military leader, in every way, in charisma, charm, he found himself lacking. And so, when Magnus tells him to remember who he is, if the Emperor is the man he believed him to be, Horus must accept that he is the Emperor's inferior. He will always be the Emperor's son. He will never stand shoulder to shoulder with his father. He will never escape his shadow. But if his father lied to him, he no longer needs to measure himself against his father, for his father has betrayed him. He has shown himself to be the most base of men, a traitor. And a traitor is no man at all. And if the Emperor is a traitor, not only is Horus the better man, because he is not betraying the Emperor, he is saving the Imperium. Horus will forever remain loyal, and he will gather those loyal to him and the Imperium around himself, and he will save the Imperium of Man from his father's tyranny. And so, finally, Horus gets to be the hero. Meanwhile, back aboard the vengeful spirit, Loken, Sigeman, and the rest are still trying to find some way of explaining what is happening. Loken has for a while now suspected that there might be some kind of supernatural influence at work, especially as he was shown a prophecy by Sigeman referring to Horus as the great betrayer, betraying his creator and indeed all of humanity. The writing seems to suggest that this was some ancient Egyptian text, and seems to suggest that this entire thing was passed on to the ancient humans by presumably the Eldar, who have a very, very, very similar prophecy. In other words, I'm not saying it was aliens, but it was aliens. And spurred on by this, they start to investigate further, looking for other ancient texts that refer to magic or sorceries or the corruption of this Horus creature. In amongst the many books are some that they cannot translate, however, they happen across a cryptographic key. In the most unusual of places, back during the war meeting on Davin before Horus went to the moon, another remembrancer who was present was Euphrates Keeler, an imaginist. Basically, she takes pictures. She happens to have taken several pictures of Erebus, and more specifically, the tattooed scripture that covers much of his skin. Upon further examination, it turns out that the scripture is remarkably similar to that found in many of these ancient books. And so, using the words of the Book of Lorgar inscribed upon Erebus' scalp, he was able to begin translating some of the old text in the library. Unfortunately for him, this is not the kind of text you want to be translating. Many of you may already be aware of this, but for the potential benefit of anyone that is not, the way that chaos works in 40k is rather subtle but also extremely predictable. Any chaotic entity requires chaos entity to fuel itself, and any chaos entity that fuels itself via chaotic entity is instinctually going to try and increase the amount of chaos energy nearby, thereby increasing the amount of fuel it can draw upon, thereby increasing the amount of fuel it can create, etc, etc, etc. Essentially, it will constantly attempt to grow itself larger, both in power and sustainability. When Sigeman began reading from this book, he happened upon a ritual. As soon as he began reading, this caused a tiny amount of chaotic energy to seep into the real world. Once that tiny sliver of energy had seeped in, he continued to read. This gave the energy enough agency to continue drawing more energy in, and very, very, very rapidly indeed, just like a dam bursting, once the energy had begun to flow, there was simply no way of stopping it. It took direct and temporary control over Sigeman, forcing him to continue the ritual until Euphrates Keeler, who was also in the room, physically ripped him away from the book. At that point, however, it was already too late, and a warp entity forced its way out of the Immaterium and onto the vengeful spirit, and began throwing chaotic fireballs all over the place. In fact, both Kirill and Euphrates would almost certainly have died then and there if it was not for the intervention of the vengeful spirit's mistress of astropaths, Ing-Mei Sing, who placed herself between them and the monstrosity. And it was roundabout now that something really, really, really interesting happened. Ing-Mei Sing, although being the chief astropath on board the Vengeful Spirit, was not anywhere even remotely close to being able to stop a chaos manifestation of this particular type, especially as she had absolutely no fucking clue what she was dealing with. As an astropath, she undoubtedly had a certain understanding of the creatures that lived inside the warp, but This, a warp creature manifested outside of the warp on a ship safe in normal space because somebody read a fucking book, was probably a little bit, outside her area of expertise, shall we say. But shortly before both Ingmei Singh and Kirill Sinderman was turned into ethereal snacks, the pictographic remembrancer Euphrates Keeler stepped between them and the angry demon, holding up a small silver aquila, a rather rare symbol at that point in time, and told the thing to fuck off back to the warp. And no, that is not much of a metaphor either. She essentially banished a demon with harsh language and faith. And as you can probably guess, no, that is not normally one of the ways one would banish demons in 30k. It usually takes a considerably larger volume of bolter fire or chain swords. Then again, I suppose it is entirely possible that nobody had tried up until that point. I mean, if a warp-spawned monstrosity looking like something out of the deepest, darkest recesses of some religious fanatic's a-hole is storming towards you, simply just yelling at it is probably not the solution that will appear in your mind first when you're trying to look for some way to make it not eat you. But beyond the merely humorous implications, this is rather interesting because it proves one thing, or well, we think it proves one thing. There is another possibility, because the thing I think it proves is that the Emperor already has some sort of power over the warp, to the point where simply just mentioning his name is enough to banish a demon. However, there is of course an alternative explanation, and that is that Euphrates Keeler is some level of psyker, and she has to be a really good one as well. Ingmei Singh could not stop this thing, and yet Euphrates Keeler, with absolutely no training or any real knowledge that she might have psychic power, managed to throw it back into the warp. That would mean that she would be a disaster-level psyker. The kind of crazy fuckers that would be able to take control over entire planets or indeed solar systems just with the power of their mind. It's gotta be said, however, that this seems rather unlikely, as anyone with that level of psychic potential would be rather obvious, shall we say. Basically, every other psyker within a couple of space sectors would in all due likelihood be able to notice her, so it is unlikely she would have been able to keep this secret, and much less likely that she simply wouldn't have goddamn noticed. A far more likely explanation, in my opinion, is probably the fact that the Emperor already had a presence within the warp. Now, I don't think this is necessarily the Emperor of 40k, the one that actually has a certain actual presence in the warp as a chaos god of sorts. Rather, I think this might have had something to do with the fact that the Emperor had, on some level, cooperated with chaotic powers in the past. We know, for example, that the Space Marines and the Astartes are not purely results of science. There is some kind of magic doodah, e.g. chaos, involved in their creation. Further into the book series, we will also learn that the Emperor had, at the very least, some vague connection or dealing with the Chaos Gods. I am thinking that perhaps he managed to steal some inkling, some iota of their power, to the point where warp entities now fear the very name of the Emperor, as his mere name now carries with it a certain significance and power to creatures of the warp. The same way that if you know a demon's real name in 40k, you will have a certain power over it. This obviously suggests that names are very, very important to demons. As such, it is not entirely impossible to suggest that the Emperor would have some form of direct influence over a demon just by the mere mention of his name. It might in fact simply just be a diametrically opposed force to the demon. As we have seen, the Emperor wants to try and eradicate chaos in its entirety from the galaxy. As such, it would not surprise me at all if that implication and that meaning then translates over into the warp, which is of course a reflection of our real world, e.g., if the Emperor is everything that has to do with anti-chaos, then the mere mention of the Emperor or his name might have anti-chaotic powers, if you get my drift. What's far more interesting, though, is what's going to be happening later on when Euphrates starts channeling, I suppose, the power of the Emperor far more directly. But we'll get to that when we get to it. Meanwhile, on the planet below, the battle for the War Master's soul was still raging. At this point, Magnus had finally made himself apparent right in front of Horus in a physical way, making sure that Horus would recognize him as his brother Magnus. They fought a short feud of words, the various parties, Erebus, Magnus, and Horus, and it becomes apparent that Magnus is not quite as woke as he might have believed himself to be. It would appear that Magnus thinks that Horus is the first to fall. In fact, when Erebus claims that he was sent to try and turn Horus on the behest of Lorgar, Magnus calls him a liar and claims that Lorgar is loyal and would never turn against the Emperor. Not exactly a surprising position to take, considering that Lorgar was the person who literally worshipped the Emperor as a god for a considerable amount of time. But at the end of the day, neither Erebus nor Magnus really had much in the ways of power for swaying Horus at this point. Magnus also committed the grave error of demonstrating his psychic powers, not only in appearing before Horus in the Immaterium, but also in trying to kill Erebus using his psychic powers. This just further demonstrated to Horus that his father was not as infallible as he had thought. After all, here was his brother, another of the Emperor's sons, blatantly disobeying their father. On the other hand, Erebus had been shown to be the snake in the grass that Horus had always partially suspected, and this would turn out rather bad for Erebus eventually, but for the moment neither could really convince Horus either way, and indeed Magnus's previous requests for Horus to remember who he was really the worst thing he could have tried at this point, as it just pushed Horus further towards the edge. The conversation ended by Horus shouting them both down and saying that he could not trust either one of them, and indeed, as the War Master, why should he? He would make his own decision on this matter. Outside the temple on Davin, a huge tent city had grown up in anticipation of the news of whether or not Horus Lupercal was dead. The Astartes had all rallied down on the planet below, and thousands of Astartes, hundreds of thousands of Imperial Army personnel, and all manners of other Navy, Army, and civilian personnel were all camped around the temple itself. And for over a week, nothing happened. In fact, many had begun to give up hope when finally, on the eve of the 9th day, the massive stone doors leading into the Temple of the Serpent slowly opened, and out stepped a fully revitalized Horus Lupercal. It would appear as if the healing temple had worked. Not only was he up and walking about, but he seemed to be the exact same man that had gone in. He met his battle brothers, his sons of Horus, with good humor and cheer, patting them on the back, and just being a generally decent person. But of course, what the sons of Horus did not know was that Horus had gone through a certain change of priorities whilst inside the temple, and he had started to see things very, very differently these days. At this moment forward, Horus was beginning to formulate his plan for righting the wrongs his father had so clearly caused him. And almost immediately we see a rather drastic change in Lupercal's strategy. Now, this is the point where we have to look a little bit closer at Horus Lupercal. Before he went inside the temple, he was a ruthless strategist, but as a diplomat and as a philosopher, I suppose, His views were largely beneficent. After all, let us not forget that he was the man who said that we needed to leave the newly conquered nations better than we found them. He genuinely believed that the purpose of the Great Crusade was to reunite the scattered pieces of humanity and reforge them into a better and more prosperous whole. As far as he was concerned, they were liberators and benefactors, not tyrants. And this older philosophy might seem to be in direct contrast to the rather brutal things he was to go on to do, but I don't actually think so. I believe that Horus committed the, well, let's be honest here and call them what they were, atrocities that he was about to commit, not because he saw them as atrocities in and of themselves, but rather he saw them as necessary hardships. He viewed war as a meticulous calculation, and his philosophy for winning a war as quickly, and therefore as painlessly as possible, was to strike with overwhelming force and savagery. His entire philosophy rested upon the idea that a war ended quickly was a war ended well. And the only way to end a war fast was to hit the enemy in such a way, with such brutality and such overwhelming force, that the enemy would see the simple act of resistance as nothing but futile suicide. And that is precisely the result that I think Horus Lupercal was trying to get at. From the moment he left the temple on Davin, he was trying to find the quickest and therefore necessarily the most vicious and brutal way of ending the war against the Imperium, so that they could all get back to, well, creating the Imperium of Man, rather than the Imperium of the Emperor. And as a first step in preparing for that war, the War Master needed to get his troops used to the idea of fighting against fellow Astartes. Now, throwing them into a battle against fellow Astartes immediately would probably not be the best solution. And luckily for Horus, the gods of plot convenience, probably, gave him just the enemy he needed. Now, granted, it is not mentioned in any of the books, but it is possible that he received some form of information from, for example, Erebus, who may have received it from some other less savory sources. But as far as we know, Horus simply stumbled upon this perfect enemy. A rather strange enemy. You would think that the odds of doing this inadvertently would be rather small. Namely, the Orician technocracy. A rather fascinating bunch of humans who base their society on the acquiring, the collection, and the deciphering of data and knowledge. Through this, they had equipped their warriors, known as the Brotherhood, with power armor. They had not been given the same genetic enhancements as the Astartes, but they wore armor that was essentially as effective. They also used bolt guns. Although less bulky, they were still more or less the same construct, and they also used the same stormbirds as the Astartes. In fact, a lot of their technology seemed to have been taken from the exact same source as the Imperium. This meant that they in all due likelihood possessed one or more pieces of STC technology. Absolute treasures to the Adeptus Mechanicus. In fact, it would be impossible to place a value on these pieces of technology. In modern 40k, a bunch of adventurers found an STC that made slightly sharper knives. All of the adventurers were awarded with their own planetary governorships. So you can imagine the value of STC technology that produced power armor, bolt guns, and stormbirds. And as usual, when such a nation was discovered, the War Master and the Sons of Horus invited them aboard the Vengeful Spirit for diplomatic talks. This was how it usually went. You find an offshoot of humanity, you see if you can establish diplomatic relationships with them, and then try and talk them into joining the wider Imperium. And considering the fact that the two seem to have so much in common, that seemed to be not at all an impossibility. As such, the usual niceties were arranged. The War Master was dressed up in his finest ceremonial armor, although, oddly enough, he was wearing a sword and pistol to this particular ceremony, and the Sons of Horus were lined up to receive the delegation from the technocracy. The delegation themselves also brought with them Brotherhood warriors encased in power armor and carrying bolt guns. However, in deference to their hosts, the Sons of Horus, they did not have any magazines in their bolt guns, nor did they carry ammunition on their person. And the meeting began nice enough with the two sides exchanging pleasantries, until Horus pulled out his pistol and shot the ambassador of the technocracy straight through the head. And immediately thereafter, the order was given for the Astartes warriors to open fire upon the Brotherhood, that this was an assassination attempt on Horus Lupercal. And so they did. Unarmed and surrounded as the Brotherhood warriors were, they were cut down in mere seconds. After the violence had ceased, the claim was that the technocrat's diplomat had somehow smuggled a digi-weapon on board. Now, a digi-weapon is a miniaturized, high-powered laser or plasma weapon, small enough to be hidden inside of a ring, or in this case, a staff of office. The claim was that once the administrator brought up the staff to salute the War Master, he was actually taking aim with a high-powered laser weapon, with the intent of killing the War Master. Quite a few within the Legion, Garviel Loken at their fore, thought this an unlikely explanation. The Brotherhood warriors had come in peace. They were not in any way prepared for a fight, and you would think that if they were planning something, at the very least they would be carrying magazines in their weapons. Or if not that, at least they would have been armed in some way, perhaps with further digi weapons, or perhaps a bomb on their transport craft, or something. Instead, they had all been butchered in mere moments by the massed firepower of hundreds of Sons of Horus. If this was an assassination attempt, it was a remarkably ill-conceived assassination attempt. Now, of course, it is possible that the Orician technocracy, a interstellar mini-empire that based their entire system of governance upon science, technology, and the advancement and understanding of knowledge, were complete and utter mouth-breathing, glue-sniffing, sheep-fucking morons. But, all in all, that would seem unlikely. And as I mentioned, quite a few within the legions thought that, yeah, that does sound somewhat odd, doesn't it? And Loken was leading the charge in this, an ever-growing sphere of discontent within the legion that was starting to wonder what the fuck was going on. And even more importantly, they were starting to ask some rather embarrassing questions. In addition to this, Loken and Tariq Torgaden had been more or less completely frozen out of the Mournival. These days, Horus really only accepted advice, aid, and guidance from little Horus Aximand, Abaddon, and Erebus. And to make matters even worse, whereas Garviel Loken and Tariq Torgaden were asking questions out of a honest sense of worry and just confusion, there was one who had somewhat less, obsequious intents. Ignace Carcassi had witnessed the massacre on the embarkation decks when the Sons of Horus had brought Horus Lupercal back on the ship, and he was dying from being stabbed by the anatheme on the moon of Davin. He had written some rather incendiary poetry about the Adeptus Astartes and their abuse of power as of late, and he had been spreading this poetry all throughout the fleet, using the same bulk presses that were used to distribute copies of the Lectitio Divinatus across the fleet. And while normally a rowdy remembrancer could simply be disposed of by any variety of accidents, this particular remembrancer was under the direct protection of Garviel Loken after the events at the Whisperheads. As such, they could not simply make Ignace disappear, as Loken was already asking questions, and if his pet remembrancer would simply up and vanish, then he would be starting to ask some really, really problematic questions. In an attempt to nail two birds with one stone, the Mournival and parts of the Lodge came up with an idea. Tariq Torgaiden, Ezekiel Abaddon, and Horus Heresy were all invited to a special gathering of the Lodge, with Malaghost and the Lodge Master. They suggested that Ignace Carcassi was becoming a real problem and that he had to be dealt with. Tariq did not like what he was hearing. He seemed in fact aghast that these people would suggest that they should murder a civilian because they didn't like the sound of his voice. But again, they could not simply get rid of Ignace, they would also have to get rid of Gaviel Loken. And this is when they suggested to Tariq that he, Horus Heresy, and Abaddon would all attest to the fact that Loken was the one guilty of the massacre on the embarkation deck. They would essentially offer up Loken as a sacrificial lamb to General Varvarus, the highest-ranking Imperial Army representative within the expedition. Ever since the massacre on the embarkation deck, Varvarus had demanded that the people responsible for the massacre on the embarkation deck be arrested and presented to a tribunal where they would be judged for their crimes. He had met a lot of resistance within the Legion, and he was just about ready to send word to Terra, demanding that justice be done for him up on high. The Lodge hoped that by offering up Gaviel Loken, a well-respected member of the Mournival, this would appease the general and, at the very least, distract him from any further ploys they might be cooking. But they also knew that they would need a full 3/4 of the Mournival to condemn him, and that included getting Tariq Torgaiden in on their planning. Unfortunately for them, Tariq was having absolutely none of this, and went so far as to pull a knife on his brothers and make it painfully clear to them that he was not about to betray Loken in any way, shape, or form. This resulted in Tariq storming out of the Lodge after having been told that if he was not with them, he was against them. This was pretty much a declaration of war from Malaghost, and by extension from the War Master, on Gaviel Loken and Tariq Torgaiden, and anyone that might follow them. However, this was a bit of a problem for them as well. Tariq and Gaviel had no idea about how far things had gotten. They still thought that this was a diplomatic quarrel, a political miscommunication, that surely they couldn't actually be thinking of doing anything of like this. They must simply just be misguided. They had no idea just how serious Malaghost was when he said that you were either with us or against us. And to be fair, neither Tariq nor Loken had all that much time to worry about interlegion politics, as they are also currently waging a war against the technocracy and the Brotherhood, a war that lasted for a full 9 months, until the technocracy was reduced to their one final bastion, a supposedly impenetrable fortress at the heart of their nation. But before we get to the boom and the bang and the climbing and the screaming and the swording and all of that nonsense, we get another look into Horus's rather, darkened psyche, shall we say. He shows up at the Lodge. He informs the Lodge members, or, well, not all of them, just a few, the head of the Lodge, Malaghost, Ezekiel Abaddon, and of course little Horus, that he was aware of the Lodge's activities all this time. Now again, whether or not he was aware of the Lodge's activities, that's one thing. Whether or not he was aware of the Lodge's actual intentions, well, that's probably different. Though I gotta admit, this comes as a bit of a surprise to me. Horus Lupercal presumably would have known that the Lodges were instituted in his legion by the Word-Bearers, and allowing such an overtly secretive and potentially religious institution, considering who made it, to take root in his legion. That doesn't really sound like something Horus would do. Personally, I'm still not entirely sure that he actually knew about this, but it would sound a hell of a lot better if he rocked out of the shadows and went like, haha, I knew all along, my sons, and act all impressive instead of going like, derp, 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 derp. It would definitely have weakened his position just a little bit if he had done that, especially as now he seems to be suggesting essentially the exact same thing that the Lodge was previously. Hector Varus, the army commander, would have to be dealt with, as would Ignace Carcassi. He did not mention Loken specifically, but it was very apparent to everyone that Loken and Tariq had fallen out of favor with the War Master. As I mentioned previously, the two had been frozen out of the Mournival. Indeed, the Mournival didn't really even exist. Ever since Davin, Horus had not met with his full Mournival even once. He had kept his counsel to Erebus, Ezekiel, and Little Horus. It seems somewhat abrupt that he decided to freeze Loken and Tariq out so quickly, but considering the fact that Loken was a rather staunch traditionalist, he probably assumed that he would not follow him. And as for Tariq, while he was not as starch-assed as Loken by any stretch of the imagination, he was also an honorable and traditional warrior. In all due likelihood, Horus did not want to risk in any way giving away his hand at this point until he had secured the loyalty of other officers within the Legion, notably Abaddon and Horus Aximand, along with at least the support of one or two Primarchs. And speaking of Primarchs, one of the first Primarchs he contacted was Angron of the World Eaters. He already knew through Erebus that Lorgar would support him. Angron would require a little bit more diplomacy, however, he would be able to ingratiate himself with the crazed leaders of the World Eaters by allowing them to run rampant against the Technocracy and their Brotherhood for an extended period of time. Generally speaking, whenever Angron and his legion was deployed, it was against enemies that the Imperium really didn't give a shit about. And even then, there was usually a fair bit of recrimination after the enemy had been defeated. In this case, however, Horus simply let Angron do whatever the hell he wanted to the Technocracy and their Brotherhood, which undoubtedly made Angron feel, at the very least, less hostile towards Horus than he normally would be. Additionally, Angron was never the most intellectual or loyal of Primarchs, so his support could probably be ensured rather easily. Unfortunately for the War Master, something well outside of his predictions happened rather suddenly. Fulgrim, at the head of his Emperor's children, suddenly arrived in the same system as Horus, and Fulgrim decided to play a little trick upon his brother. He sailed his fleet up close and undetected to the War Master fleet, and at one point he was even almost about to order his fleet to open fire upon Horus's 63rd expedition. The exact reasons for why we'll delve into later. It would appear that Horus's plans had received a little bit of a shot across the bow, and potentially one straight into it as well. If Fulgrim was here, there was only one reason: he had been dispatched. Primarchs just don't show up on other Primarchs' doorsteps unannounced unless they want an element of surprise. Worst case scenario, Fulgrim could have been sent by the rulership of Terra because they suspected his rebellion, and Fulgrim could have been sent therefore to sniff out his loyalties and, if necessary, stop him. It wasn't quite that bad, however. Fulgrim had been sent by the Administratum, or, well, what passes for an Administratum anyways, during this time of the Imperium, but it was not because they suspected Horus directly. Rather, Horus chose to play his hand and invite Fulgrim into the heresy. Luckily for him, other powers had already moved on Fulgrim and corrupted his mind. Again, this was a conspiracy long in the making. If Fulgrim had not already been affected by the ruinous Chaos Gods, this, in all due likelihood, would have been the end of Horus's rebellion right then and there. As it was, however, Horus escaped with the closest of shaves. And speaking of shaving, a interesting happenstance took place. Fulgrim's chief apothecary, one Fabius Bile, went to the apothecarium aboard the Vengeful Spirit and requested to be given the anathema that had wounded Horus Lupercal. He had with him a writ signed by Fulgrim and Horus, allowing the anathema to be transferred from the ownership of the Sons of Horus to the Emperor's children. This undoubtedly was a fair bit of a gamble from Horus' side. He had just given a brother he was not yet entirely sure he could trust the means to possibly assassinate Horus. But again, seeing as their alliance at this point was rather fragile and improvised, should we say, a little bit of a cherry on top might have been just what the burgeoning alliance needed. And so, with a disaster narrowly averted, Horus could return his attention to the technocracy and what remained of the Brotherhood. One last citadel, built with old-age tech. The walls quite literally repaired themselves as they were bombarded. It took the combined artillery power of the 63rd Expedition and a considerable portion of the 10th Legion, the World Eaters, to bombard a section of the wall into rubble, so that they could create a breach and prepare for an escalade. The escalade would be led by Angron himself, supported by the Sons of Horus under the command of Gavia Loken and Tariq Torgaiden, both commanding their respective companies. This was a little bit unusual, considering the fact that neither of them were exactly in favor at the moment, and leading the last assault upon an enemy's last defensive position was considered quite an honor. But unusual as it might have been, Astartes are not in the habit of questioning orders. And considering how nasty this particular charge was going to be, it is entirely possible that both of them viewed it as much of a punishment as an honor. Now, as for the assault itself, as you can probably imagine, charging a huge fortified structure in 40k, with weapons like mortar, artillery batteries, machine guns, bolters, etc., is not a pleasant affair, even for the Legiones Astartes, and considering the fact that the Brotherhood had access to bolter weapons, they could in all due likelihood defeat Astartes' power armor. Perhaps not easily and perhaps not flawlessly, but they could pierce their armor. And perched atop a massive curtain wall, the defenders would have every single advantage, except for one, namely that the charge up the breach would be led by a Primarch, and perhaps the nastiest, most brutally violent of them all, Angron. The Brotherhood, however, were not complete idiots. They had seen Angron fight before. They knew they couldn't stop him, and so they had mined the breach itself with a seismic mine. Once Angron was far enough up the breach, then detonated this mine, which for a brief moment reversed gravity in the area, sending thousands of tons of rock shooting out in all directions, as up became down and down became up. In but a single moment, practically the entire vanguard, including Angron, was buried beneath thousands of tons of rubble. If the assault was being made by any conventional force, the assault would in all due likelihood have ended then and there, with the spear tip completely and utterly shattered. However, legionnaires don't give up quite that easily. And whilst the spear tip might be broken, the haft, consisting of the Sons of Horus, was still intact, and with Gavia, Loken, and Tariq leading them, they rushed up the breach as quickly as they could, now that it was for a moment relatively undefended. Due to the fact that they had mined the opening, the Brotherhood had not placed any heavy weapons nor troopers at the top of the breach itself, seeing as any troops up there would almost certainly be caught in the detonation of the seismic mine. This gave the Sons of Horus a few brief vital moments to climb up as far as they can and meet the Brotherhood at the top of the breach, instead of getting pinned down by automatic weapons fire, scything down at them from an elevated position. And whilst again, conventional troops would have had absolutely no chance of covering that distance quickly enough, these were legionnaires, and they made it to the top just in time to meet the Brotherhood's heavy weapon teams trying to set up, and in close quarters combat, the Brotherhood warriors were absolutely no match for the Astartes. They might have the power armor, and they might have the weapons, but they did not have the training, the experience, or the brute force potential of Legiones Astartes. And so, after a brief but bloody skirmish, the Astartes had secured the top of the breach. At this point, there was nothing the Brotherhood could do to stop the Astartes from streaming into their last strong point. At this point, the citadel was as good as lost. The Brotherhood could perhaps hold out within the walls and within the fortified strongpoints of the citadel for a few more hours, but they knew that the battle was over. And so the Brotherhood decided that the only honourable thing left to do to spare the lives of the civilians inside the fortress and the rest of their soldiers was to surrender. A procession of Brotherhood soldiers, along with diplomats and other administrative personnel, marched out from the inner keep under a banner of truce, and surrendered themselves to Hector Varvar, who climbed over the breach in his finest dress uniform, guided in by an honour guard. It would appear that the conflict against the technocracy had finally ended, and at least it had ended with a modicum of honour and respect. It was until Angron showed up anyways. As you could probably imagine, simply just being buried between a couple 100 tons of rock was not enough to finish the World Eater's Primarch, who came screaming out of the rock pile, still rather confused and bloodthirsty, and barreled into the remaining Brotherhood personnel and the diplomats and began butchering them. In the chaos and panic, the remaining Brotherhood warriors did the only thing they could. They raised their weapons and tried to resist, but they were surrounded both by Imperial Army troops and Astartes legionnaires. And so, the war against the technocracy came to an ignoble end, with the last of its defenders butchered as they attempted to surrender. And amongst the casualties was Hector Vivar, apparently having been killed by the last bullet fired in the last battle on the last planet in the last citadel. It was nothing short of a tragedy, and to honor the sacrifice of Vivar, Horus decreed that these worlds of the technocracy conquered in the name of the War Master would be offered up to Vivar's loyal soldiers. They would be allowed to settle these planets one in his and the War Master's name, and stand guard over them in the name of their beloved Lord General. This was the highest honor that could possibly be bestowed upon an Imperial Army unit, to be allowed to settle a conquered planet and live out the rest of their lives in peace. Not to mention, it was monstrously convenient for Horus. One of the men that had been calling for justice for what had happened on the embarkation deck had died, and all those loyal to him had been conveniently shuffled out of the way and charged with guarding a bunch of worlds nicely and safely out of the way of Horus's own ambitions. And the convenient coincidences did not stop there. Ignace Carcassi was found dead in his private quarters. Apparently, the guilt of what he had done, of painting the Astartes in such a bad light, had been too much for him, and he had taken his own life by blowing his brains out. Additionally, Horus's remembrancer Petronella Vivar had had an accident. Her neck had been snapped with great and overwhelming force. Carcassi's death was ruled a suicide, and poor Petronella had probably fallen down some stairs, or something to that effect, and her body was shipped back to Terra, except, of course, for her recording implants and various transcripts, because, of course, Horus had said some rather unguarded things to her, as he lay dying on the medica deck of the Vengeful Spirit after the events that had transpired on Davin's moon. Things that would have been rather unfortunate should they have happened to come out to a wider public. Luckily, that was not something they had to worry about. It all just seemed so damn convenient. And there were a few others that had thought the same thing. Ignace Carcassi had never touched a gun in his life. Petronella Vivar, surrounded by her bodyguards, were unlikely to have tripped down a set of stairs. And as for the last bullet that happened to find its way into Vavaris' skull, well, someone decided to run a test on that bullet fragment to see if they could figure out exactly what had happened. And much to Garviel Loken's surprise, the test came back suggesting that what had hit Vavaris was a bolt shell fragment. Not the type fired by the Brotherhood, but standard issue Legion munitions. How strange indeed. It was as if everything was going according to a plan. A plan that would see Magnus the Red chastised for his breach of the Emperor's edict. Horus had personally contacted Leman Russ and informed him of Horus's breach of confidence, and suggested to him that perhaps Leman Russ's original orders about guiding Magnus back to Terra might not be possible after all. Perhaps Russ should take a somewhat more direct approach to ensure that everything goes smoothly. And perhaps Guilliman should take most of his legion and rendezvous at Calth, where he would meet up with Lorgar's word-bearers to launch a crusade against the minor Orc Empire, and perhaps Sanguinius should venture out to the Signum cluster, where he would find a surprise waiting for him. It was almost as if everything was going exactly as planned.